There is a version of World War I that most people carry in their heads. It involves mud. It involves poppies. It involves the image of young men going over the top of a trench, rifles in hand, moving into smoke and noise, and dying in great numbers for reasons that were never adequately explained to them. That version is real in the way that a photograph of a burning building is real. It captures something, but it leaves out the temperature of the fire, the smell of the smoke, the sound of the structure collapsing floor by floor in the dark. It leaves out the part that actually defines the event. What follows is not a story about heroism or tragedy in the literary sense. It is a record of what became normal, what became procedure, what became, in the most chilling sense of the word, routine. World War I did not begin as a mechanized slaughter. It began as what many European military planners expected to be a short, decisive conflict, a matter of weeks or months at most, one that would resolve the entangled alliance systems of the continent and allow everyone to return to their ordinary lives before the snow fell. That expectation was not naivety. It was based on the last major European wars, which had moved quickly and ended with clear outcomes. The Franco-Prussian War of 1870 lasted less than a year. The wars of German unification were surgical by the standards of what was coming. Military strategists on both sides had built their entire planning architecture around the idea of rapid movement, decisive engagement, and swift conclusion. They were wrong in a way that had no precedent in human history, and by the time the error became undeniable, millions of men were already committed to positions they could not leave. The Western Front stabilized into trenches by the end of 1914. That stabilization was not a military decision in the conventional sense. It was the result of both sides running out of the ability to advance. The industrial capacity of modern nations had produced weapons that could kill faster than armies could move, and so movement stopped. What replaced it was something that had never existed at this scale before. A permanent, inhabited, bureaucratically managed killing zone, stretching from the English Channel to the Swiss border, roughly 440 miles of excavated earth, wire, and organized death. Men moved into that zone. Some of them did not come out for years, some of them did not come out at all. The first thing that needs to be understood about trench life is that it was not primarily characterized by battle. It was characterized by waiting. The average soldier on the Western Front spent the vast majority of his time not in combat, but in a state of enforced proximity to conditions that were designed, even if not consciously, to destroy the human body and the human mind through simple endurance. The trenches were dug into clay and chalk, and whatever soil happened to underlie the particular stretch of France or Belgium, a unit was assigned to. That soil in the winter months became saturated with water. The drainage systems that engineers attempted to build were primitive and frequently destroyed by shell fire. The result was that men stood for hours and days and sometimes weeks in water that reached their knees. The water was not clean. It was mixed with mud, with human waste, with the residue of decaying organic matter that included at various points along the line the bodies of men and animals who had died in previous engagements and had not been recovered. Men stood in that water because there was nowhere else to stand. Trench foot emerged from this as one of the defining medical realities of the war. It was not a dramatic injury. It did not come from a bullet or a shell. It came from prolonged exposure to cold, wet conditions, and it progressed in stages that were methodically documented in medical reports that were then, in many cases, suppressed or minimized in official communications because the scale of the problem reflected poorly on the organization of the army. In the early stages, trench foot caused numbness and swelling. In later stages, the flesh began to decay while still attached to the living body. In severe cases, gangrene set in and amputation became the only option. During the first winter of the war, the British Army alone recorded tens of thousands of cases. The treatment, once the condition was recognized and prioritized, was relatively straightforward. Dry socks, whale oil applied to the feet, regular rotation out of the wet trenches. The knowledge of how to prevent it existed. The organizational will to implement prevention consistently did not always follow. particularly in units where the pressure to maintain positions overrode concern for the physical condition of the men maintaining them. This was one of the first norms that the war established and that the war's official history struggled to contain. The norm was not that men suffered from preventable conditions. The norm was that the suffering from preventable conditions was treated as an expected cost of maintaining military efficiency, and that the men who suffered were evaluated not primarily as human beings requiring care, but as assets requiring management. A soldier with trench foot was a logistical problem. He needed to be replaced. The replacement needed to be found, transported, and briefed. The paperwork needed to be completed. The suffering itself was secondary to the administrative process it generated. Lice were universal. This is not a rhetorical statement. It is a documented fact that virtually every man who served in the trenches of the Western Front, regardless of rank, was infested with body lice at some point during his service, and in many cases, the infestation was permanent and continuous for the duration of his time at the front. Lice lived in the seams of clothing, in the fabric of uniforms, in the hair of men who had no access to bathing facilities. They caused constant itching and sleep disruption. They transmitted trench fever, a disease caused by the bacterium Bartonella quintana, which produced recurring high fevers, severe headaches, and pain in the legs and back that could incapacitate a man for weeks. Trench fever was not fatal in most cases, but it was debilitating, and it was among the most common causes of temporary combat inefficiency in the British Army. The response to lice was not systematic decontamination, because systematic decontamination was logistically impossible in the field conditions of the Western Front. The response was individual soldiers picking through their own clothing by candlelight in dugouts, attempting to kill insects by running the flame of a candle along the seams of their shirts, listening to the small sounds of lice popping in the heat. This activity, called chatting, was performed daily by millions of men. It became social. Men sat together and deloused each other in the same way that primates groom. The domestication of this process, the way it became a communal ritual, was itself a marker of how thoroughly the war had redefined what counted as normal human activity. Rats were the other constant. The trenches of the Western Front were inhabited by rats in numbers that contemporary accounts describe with a consistency that makes the scale impossible to doubt. The rats were large, fed as they were on the most abundant food source in the environment. They moved through the trenches at night with the confidence of animals that had learned they were not meaningfully threatened. They entered dugouts. They moved across sleeping men. They ate the food supplies that soldiers stored. And they ate, when the opportunity presented itself, the bodies of the dead. The bodies of the dead were not always promptly removed. In many cases, particularly after large engagements, the dead lay in no man's land or in collapsed sections of trench for days or weeks before recovery was possible. The rats fed on them. Men who woke in the night and heard the sounds from no man's land learned, over time, to identify which sounds came from rats and which came from wounded men who had not yet died. Both sounds became familiar. Neither remained shocking for long. The normalization of the dead is one of the central psychological processes of the Western Front, and it is one that the official accounts of the war handled with extraordinary care, because the full reality of it implied things about the effect of the war on the men who fought it that governments were not prepared to acknowledge publicly. The dead were everywhere. In the early phases of a sector's occupation, bodies might be buried in the walls of the trenches themselves, incorporated into the physical structure of the fortification. As the trenches were dug deeper and extended and reinforced, it was common for workers to break into earlier burials. Men repaired trench walls using sandbags and earth and whatever materials were available, and those materials sometimes included human remains. A foot protruding from a trench wall, a hand emerging from the mud at knee height. These things were noted in diaries. They were not uniformly horrifying to the men who encountered them, because the frequency of encounter had produced a calibration of response that would be unrecognizable to anyone who had not experienced the same conditions. The smell of the front was one of the most consistently reported sensory details in the testimonies of veterans, and it is the detail most consistently absent from popular representations of the war. The smell came from multiple sources simultaneously, from unwashed bodies in enclosed spaces, from the latrines that were dug into the rear walls of trenches and that overflowed in wet conditions, from the chemical residue of high explosive, from the gases that pooled in low-lying areas and that had their own distinct odors depending on their composition, and from the decomposition of organic matter on a scale that produced a pervasive, underlying note to the entire environment that men described as sweet in a way that was immediately identifiable as decay. Soldiers who came back from leave described the smell as the thing that returned most powerfully when they reached the front. Veterans in later decades described the smell returning in memory without warning, triggered by combinations of damp earth and cold air that occurred in entirely different contexts. The management of bodies was a distinct military administrative function. The British Army had dedicated graves registration units whose job was to locate, identify and record the dead. This work was performed under fire, in conditions that made systematic identification frequently impossible, by men who had to handle remains in states of decomposition that ranged from recent to unrecognizable. The records these units produced were meticulous because meticulous records served the administrative function of officially closing the file on a man. A death recorded was a pension processed, a next of kin notified, a replacement requisitioned. The record was the institutional acknowledgement that the asset had been expended. The man himself, in the physical sense, was often unrecoverable. Of the approximately 1 million British and Commonwealth soldiers who died on the Western Front, more than 300,000 have no known grave. They are commemorated on monuments that list names, thousands and thousands of names, carved into stone, which is the official response to the fact that the bodies could not be found or could not be identified. The question of what the war did to the minds of the men who fought it was handled by military and medical authorities with a combination of genuine scientific uncertainty and deliberate institutional suppression that produced one of the longest-running cover-ups in the history of military medicine. Shell shock was the popular term. The official term varied across the war and across different national armies, and the variation was not merely semantic. It reflected a deep institutional anxiety about what acknowledging the psychological casualties of modern warfare implied about the nature of the war itself, about the validity of continuing it, and about the moral responsibility of the institutions that were sending men into the conditions that produced the casualties. The symptoms of what we now recognize as combat-induced psychological trauma presented in a range of ways that contemporary military doctors struggled to categorize. Some men went mute. Some men developed uncontrollable tremors that made them unable to hold a rifle. Some men could not stop weeping. Some men lost the ability to walk, developing functional paralysis with no apparent physical cause. Some men developed facial tics and repetitive behaviors. Some men simply could not stop shaking. Some men experienced what would now be identified as dissociative states, becoming disconnected from their surroundings in ways that made them appear catatonic or irrational. The common factor across all these presentations was exposure to the particular combination of sustained artillery bombardment, proximity to death and mutilation, sleep deprivation, physical discomfort, and institutional powerlessness that defined frontline service on the Western Front. The early military response to these presentations was punitive. Men who could not function were suspected of cowardice, of malingering, of attempting to escape their duty through psychological manipulation. The British Army's official position in the early years of the war was that shell shock was not a legitimate medical condition, but a failure of moral fiber, a collapse of the will that a man of sufficient character should be able to overcome. This position was not held by all military doctors. A number of medical officers who worked directly with affected men recognized that something was happening that exceeded the available frameworks of military discipline and moral evaluation. But the institutional position created real consequences for real men. Soldiers displaying psychological symptoms were, in a significant number of cases, returned to frontline duty without treatment. In cases where the symptoms led to desertion, to refusal of orders, or to behavior that the military classified as cowardice, the consequences were more severe. Over 300 British and Commonwealth soldiers were executed for offences, including cowardice and desertion during World War I. The executions were carried out by firing squad, composed of men from the condemned soldier's own unit. The procedure was formal. There was paperwork. The execution was recorded in the unit war diary as a routine administrative entry, the same format used to record supply deliveries and officer transfers. In many cases, the men who were executed were demonstrably suffering from what would today be diagnosed as severe combat stress reactions or post-traumatic stress disorder. The medical examinations that preceded the courts-martial were frequently perfunctory. In some cases, defense counsel was inadequate or absent. The men were shot, the records were filed, and the units moved on. The families of executed men were not always told the truth about how their sons or husbands had died. They received notification of death in service, which was technically accurate, and which entitled them to the same condolences as the families of men killed in action. But they did not always receive the information that the death had been by military execution rather than by enemy action. The pension entitlements of executed men were, in some cases, withheld from their families on the grounds that execution for cowardice constituted conduct unbecoming. The files were sealed. In some cases, they remained sealed for decades. The artillery bombardment was the defining technical feature of the Western Front, and its effects on human beings were documented with a thoroughness that the official communications of the war consistently failed to transmit to the populations at home. The heavy guns used on the Western Front fired shells of immense destructive capacity, and the barrages that preceded major offensive operations lasted not hours, but days. The preparatory bombardment before the Battle of the Somme in July 1916 lasted 7 days. Over 1.5 million shells were fired by British guns alone. The purpose was to destroy the German defensive positions, to cut the barbed wire in no man's land, and to kill or stun the defenders so that the attacking infantry could advance across the open ground without being met by effective resistance. The bombardment failed in its purpose, in large part because the German dugouts were deep enough to protect their occupants from most of the shelling, and because the wire, rather than being cut by the explosions, was in many cases simply redistributed, creating new obstacles that the infantry encountered when they went over the top on the morning of July 1st. On that morning, the British Army suffered approximately 57,000 casualties, of whom nearly 20,000 were killed. This is the highest single-day casualty figure in the history of the British Army. The figure was not released to the British public at the time. What was released was a communiqué from General Headquarters that described the first day of the Battle of the Somme as going generally satisfactory, that the troops had everywhere gained their objectives, and that the casualties had not been heavy. The gap between this official communication and the reality experienced by the men who had survived the first day, by the medical units processing the wounded, and by the families who had already begun receiving the telegrams, was one of the most stark demonstrations of institutional information management in the history of modern warfare. The management of information about casualties was systematic and intentional. Newspapers in Britain, France, and Germany operated under censorship regimes that controlled what could be reported about the progress of the war, about the scale of losses, and about the conditions at the front. The British Press Bureau reviewed all dispatches from war correspondents. Correspondents who reported too candidly about conditions at the front were accredited, which meant they could be removed from access to the front entirely. The result was a war coverage environment in which the newspapers available to the families of soldiers fighting in France described an experience that bore little relationship to what those soldiers were actually living through. Letters from the front were censored by officers who reviewed outgoing mail and removed passages that described conditions, casualties, or morale in terms that might have undermined public support for the war. Men at the front developed private codes and euphemisms to communicate things that they knew could not be stated plainly, and families at home learned to read the gaps in what was written as carefully as the words themselves. The medical reality of the wounds produced by modern industrial weapons was another area in which the distance between official communication and documented fact was substantial. High-explosive shells produced wounds that were categorically different from the bullet wounds that military surgeons had trained to treat. A shell fragment entering the body at high velocity carried with it debris from the environment, fabric from clothing, particles of soil and organic matter that produced infections of a kind and scale that overwhelmed the medical systems of all the major powers in the early phases of the war. Gas gangrene, caused by the bacterium Clostridium perfringens, was endemic in wound infections on the Western Front because the agricultural soil of France and Belgium, which had been worked for centuries and fertilized with manure, was saturated with the spores. A wound that would have been manageable in a clean environment became life-threatening within hours when contaminated with the soil of the Western Front. Surgeons worked in conditions that violated every principle of the antiseptic surgery that had been developed over the previous 50 years. The casualty clearing stations that received the wounded from the front were overwhelmed after major engagements, handling hundreds or thousands of casualties simultaneously in facilities designed for far smaller throughput. Triage was practiced, which meant that men were sorted by the likelihood of survival given available resources, and that men below a certain threshold of survivability were designated for comfort care rather than active treatment and placed in areas where they were given morphine and left to die. This was not a failure of the system. This was the system operating as designed. The system was designed to maximize the return of functional soldiers to frontline duty, and it evaluated individual patients against that objective. The nature of facial wounds produced by the war created a category of casualty that the existing medical system had no framework to address. Shell fire, machine gun fire, and shrapnel produced wounds to the face that shattered bone structure, destroyed features, and left men alive, but with faces that contemporary surgical techniques could not reconstruct. These men presented a particular problem for military authorities because they were living evidence of what the weapons of the war actually did to human bodies, and their appearance in public spaces produced reactions in civilian populations that authorities were concerned would undermine support for the war. Special hospitals were established for men with severe facial injuries. In Britain, the pioneering plastic surgeon Harold Gillies developed reconstructive surgical techniques at the Queen's Hospital in Sidcup that were genuinely innovative and that laid foundations for modern reconstructive surgery. But Gillies and his colleagues were working at the frontier of what medicine could do, and many of the men they treated underwent dozens of procedures over years and still emerged with faces that were, by any ordinary standard, unrecognizable as the faces they had worn before the war. Some hospitals treating facial injury cases installed mirrors in the wards. Some deliberately did not. The question of when and whether a man should see his own face after reconstructive surgery, or after the decision had been made that reconstruction was not possible, was treated as a medical decision that was actually a psychological decision, that was actually an institutional decision about how to manage a population of men who had been permanently and visibly marked by the violence the institution had sent them into. There are accounts of men learning what their faces looked like through the reactions of visitors rather than through mirrors. There are accounts of men refusing to see their families. There are accounts of men who had been engaged to be married, writing to release their fiancés from the engagement because they believed no woman should be expected to live with a face like theirs. These letters were not dramatic. They were matter of fact, in the way that men who had spent years in the industrialized machinery of the Western Front had learned to be matter of fact about things that had no adequate emotional vocabulary. The use of poison gas by both sides introduced a weapon that violated the limited international agreements about the conduct of warfare that had been developed in the preceding decades, and that produced a category of casualty unique in its combination of lethality and the duration of suffering it imposed. The first large-scale use of chlorine gas by German forces at Ypres in April 1915 was a tactical surprise that produced mass casualties among Allied troops who had no protective equipment and no experience of the weapon's effects. Chlorine gas attacks the respiratory system, producing a sensation described by survivors as a burning in the throat and chest that intensified with every breath. Men who had been trained to advance in the face of shellfire and machine gun fire found themselves unable to control the reflex to flee from an invisible weapon that attacked breathing itself. The initial gas attacks produced panic and disorganized retreat on a scale that had not been seen on the Western Front since the mobile phase of 1914. The Allied response was the development of protective equipment and the development of Allied gas capabilities that eventually exceeded the scale and variety of German gas weapons. Phosgene, which was responsible for the majority of gas-related deaths in the war, acted more slowly than chlorine and was less immediately detectable, which made it more lethal because men exposed to it did not always recognize the exposure until the symptoms became severe. Mustard gas, introduced by Germany in 1917, was not primarily a lethal agent. It was an incapacitating agent designed to cause casualties that would overwhelm medical systems rather than to kill outright. Mustard gas burned the skin, the eyes, and the respiratory tract, and its effects were delayed, meaning that men who had been exposed often did not recognize the exposure until hours later, when the symptoms began to manifest. The chemical was heavier than air and pooled in low-lying areas. It contaminated soil and persisted in the environment for extended periods. Men moved through contaminated areas and were exposed without knowing it. The subsequent casualties presented with blistered skin, swollen eyes that sealed shut from inflammation, and respiratory damage that ranged from temporary to permanent. The psychological effect of gas on frontline soldiers extended beyond the casualties it produced. The requirement to put on a gas mask within seconds of detecting an alarm, in the dark, in the middle of artillery bombardment, while also performing other combat tasks, created a layer of constant anxiety that was added to the already substantial burden of psychological stress that frontline service imposed. Men developed gas-related anxieties that caused them to hear gas alarms that were not sounding, to smell gas that was not present, to experience panic responses to ordinary chemical odors that triggered association with the front. These responses were classified in the medical literature of the time as symptoms of hysteria or neurasthenia, and they were treated with varying degrees of sympathy depending on the attitudes of the medical officers involved and the institutional pressures of the moment. The category of missing in action was another of the war's administrative innovations that functioned as a mechanism for managing the gap between institutional information and human reality. A man classified as missing was a man for whom there was no confirmed record of death, but also no confirmed record of survival. He might be a prisoner of war. He might be lying wounded in an aid station under a name that had been recorded incorrectly. He might have been killed and his remains unrecovered. He might have been killed and his remains unidentifiable. He might have been killed and simply absorbed into the churned earth of the battlefield in a way that left no physical evidence of his individual existence. The missing category kept all these possibilities simultaneously open, and for the families waiting at home, it created a condition of suspended grief that could last for years. The bureaucratic processing of missing cases was performed by dedicated units that compiled reports, contacted prisoner of war camps in neutral countries, checked medical records, and attempted to trace the last known movements of missing men through witness accounts from surviving members of their units. This work was painstaking and frequently inconclusive. Men reported missing after a particular engagement might remain officially unresolved for months or years, their status finally closed by a determination of killed in action at the end of the war or after, when it became clear that no other explanation would be forthcoming. The families of missing men occupied a social position that had no established cultural script. They were not widows, because there was no confirmed death. They were not wives of living men, because there was no confirmation of life. The grief they experienced was real and continuous, but it was grief without the social rituals that grief normally triggers. because those rituals required certainty about the fact of death. The labor of the armies on the Western Front extended beyond fighting. The infrastructure of the front, the trenches themselves, the communication trenches that connected the front line to the rear, the roads, the supply depots, the drainage systems, the artillery emplacements, all of it required continuous construction and maintenance by men who were also expected to be available for combat. Working parties went out at night to repair wire and improve fortifications. They carried supplies forward through communication trenches that were themselves under intermittent shell fire. They dug. The Western Front required an enormous amount of digging, and the digging was done largely by hand, by men who were already physically exhausted from their other duties, in conditions of cold and wet and darkness, under the additional stress of knowing that the sounds of digging could attract fire. Labor battalions were organized for the heaviest construction work, and these units included men who had been deemed medically unfit for frontline combat duty, but who were still considered physically capable of manual labor. They also included workers from the British Empire, from China, from Egypt, from South Africa, from the West Indies, from India, who were recruited to perform the logistical and construction work that kept the armies functioning. The Chinese Labor Corps alone contributed approximately 100,000 workers to the British war effort. These men were not soldiers. They were contracted workers who had been recruited with promises that varied in accuracy. They worked under military discipline in dangerous conditions, often in proximity to the front, and when they were killed by enemy action, their deaths were recorded in the same administrative categories as the deaths of combat soldiers, which meant they were eligible for the same formal commemoration. But the circumstances of their recruitment, the limitations on their movement and communication, and the conditions of their employment amounted in some cases to a form of industrial conscription that bore little relationship to the voluntary service that the official narrative of the war described. The experience of men of color in the armies of the European powers reflected the racial hierarchies of the imperial systems that had mobilized them. Black soldiers from the French Empire fought in the French army in significant numbers, and they served in frontline combat roles that produced casualties proportional to those experienced by French metropolitan troops. But their treatment within the military system reflected the assumptions of colonial administration, with implications for promotion, for medical care, and for the official recognition of their service that diverged from the treatment of white soldiers in ways that the official histories of the war consistently minimized. The same patterns appeared in the British imperial forces, in the treatment of soldiers from India, from Africa, and from the Caribbean, whose service was essential to the functioning of the British military machine and whose contribution was acknowledged in terms that rarely translated into practical equality. The relationship between the military command structures and the soldiers they commanded was mediated by a layer of communication that was controlled at multiple levels and that filtered information in both directions in ways that served institutional interests rather than operational accuracy. Officers at the front sent reports upward through the chain of command that described conditions and progress in terms calibrated to what their superiors wanted to hear, because the consequences of reporting failure or difficulty were personal and immediate in ways that the consequences of inaccuracy were not. Staff officers at Corps and Army headquarters made decisions based on these filtered reports, decisions about when to attack and with what resources, decisions that determined how many men would die in what period of time. The staff officers lived behind the front, in chateau and country houses requisitioned for military use, in conditions of relative comfort that contrasted with the front-line experience in ways that soldiers at the time noted with bitterness, and that historians have documented with some care. The figure of the staff officer who planned operations from comfortable distance became one of the defining resentments of the Western Front experience, and the resentment was not entirely fair in its individual applications, because many staff officers worked extremely hard under extreme pressure and were genuinely attempting to solve problems that had no good solutions. But it was not entirely unfair either, because the system that placed decision-making authority with men who were physically isolated from the conditions of the decisions they were making produced a persistent disconnection between the operational plans and the reality that the men implementing them encountered. The great offensives of the war, the Somme, Passchendaele, Verdun, were planned with expectations of success that the conditions at the front made impossible, and the gap between the planned outcome and the actual outcome was bridged, in each case, by the bodies of men who had been committed to the operation on the basis of the planned outcome, and who were not withdrawn when the planned outcome failed to materialize. The issue of shell ammunition supply was one of the major scandals of the early years of the war, and one of the clearest demonstrations of the relationship between industrial production and mass death that defined the conflict. The armies of 1914 went to war with artillery ammunition supplies calculated on the basis of historical consumption rates from previous wars, rates that bore no relationship to the rate at which the artillery of the Western Front would actually consume shells. Within months of the war's beginning, all the major powers were experiencing critical ammunition shortages that limited what their artillery could do and placed additional burden on the infantry. In Britain, the shortage became public in 1915 through reports that were, for once, not successfully suppressed by military censorship, partly because the censorship system was not yet fully developed, and partly because the reports came from sources that had political connections that made suppression difficult. The response was the mobilization of the entire British industrial economy for munitions production, a transformation that drew millions of workers into factories producing shells, propellant, fuses, and all the other components of industrialized warfare. This mobilization included women in unprecedented numbers. Women working in shell-filling factories where they handled TNT and other explosive materials that caused a condition called toxic jaundice, a yellowing of the skin caused by chemical exposure that gave affected workers the nickname Canary Girls. The factories were dangerous. There were explosions. There were industrial accidents. There were the slower-moving consequences of chemical exposure that took years to manifest as organ damage and shortened lives. These casualties were not counted among the war's military dead. They occupied a different administrative category, which meant they occupied a different social category, which meant the relationship between their suffering and the prosecution of the war was not part of the official accounting of what the war cost. The total cost of the war, measured in human lives, has been estimated at between 17 and 20 million deaths, a range that reflects the genuine difficulty of counting across multiple national archives with different standards of record-keeping, different definitions of war-related death, and different political incentives for accuracy. The military deaths alone, across all theaters and all powers, exceeded 9 million. The civilian deaths from direct violence, from famine and disease associated with the war's disruption of food supply and civil order, from the influenza pandemic that emerged in the final year of the war and whose spread was facilitated by the movement of troops across the globe, added millions more. The influenza pandemic of 1918 and 1919 killed an estimated 50 million people worldwide, a figure that exceeded the military deaths of the war itself by a factor of 5 or more. And its relationship to the war's conditions was documented by contemporary epidemiologists and then largely separated from the war's accounting in subsequent historical memory, treated as a natural disaster rather than a consequence of the largest mobilization of human populations the world had yet seen. The demobilization that followed the armistice of November 1918 was handled with a bureaucratic efficiency that was, in retrospect, its most remarkable feature. Millions of men were processed out of the military systems that had consumed years of their lives. They received their back pay. They received a certificate of discharge. They received, in many cases, a suit of civilian clothes. They were told that the country owed them a great debt and that they were returning to a land fit for heroes, a phrase that became, in the years that followed, one of the bitterest ironies of the post-war period, as the economic and social conditions to which the veterans returned failed to materialize in the form that the phrase had implied. The men who came back carried what they had experienced in ways that the existing social and medical frameworks could not accommodate. The psychological injuries of the war were not recognized as service-related conditions in a way that created systematic entitlement to treatment. Men with severe trauma symptoms were evaluated on a case-by-case basis, with outcomes that depended heavily on the attitudes of the particular doctors and pension board members they encountered. Many men received nothing. Many men received small pensions that were subject to periodic review, and that could be reduced or terminated if the reviewing body determined that the man's condition had improved or that it was not definitively caused by his service. The burden of proof rested with the veteran. The men who had been disfigured faced a social reintegration that was managed, to the extent it was managed at all, by voluntary organizations and charitable efforts rather than by systematic state provision. The hospitals that had treated them during the war were gradually demobilized. The surgeons returned to civilian practice. The patients who were still in long-term care were transferred to reduced care facilities or released into communities that had no infrastructure for receiving them. The face was the primary surface of social identity, and men whose faces had been reconstructed through multiple surgeries, whose features remained distorted by the limitations of what 1918-era surgery could achieve, moved through a society that had no established protocol for responding to them. Some found communities of veterans where the shared experience of the war created a context that made the visible evidence of it less isolating. Many did not. The war graves that were established across France and Belgium and the other theaters of the war were the subject of one of the more extraordinary administrative decisions of the post-war period. The British government, confronted with the question of what to do with the hundreds of thousands of graves that had been dug in the war zone, made the decision that the bodies would not be repatriated. They would remain where they were, in the soil of the countries where they had fallen, under the care of what became the Imperial War Graves Commission. The decision was contested. Some families wanted their sons and husbands back. The government held firm. The official justification was that equality in death required that all the war dead be treated the same, that an army that had fought together should lie together, and that permitting the repatriation of some bodies while others remained unrecoverable would create an inequality that was incompatible with the dignity of the sacrifice. The practical effect of the policy was that the bodies remained and the families traveled. Pilgrimages to the war graves became one of the defining phenomena of the post-war decades, as mothers and wives and siblings made journeys to France and Belgium to stand at headstones and look at names carved in stone above ground that contained, in the best case, their individual dead, and in the worst case, simply the ground where the dead had fallen without recoverable remains. The cemeteries that the War Graves Commission designed and maintained were formally beautiful in a way that was clearly intentional. Carefully tended lawns and uniform white headstones in rows that created an impression of order and equality that had not characterized the deaths the graves commemorated. The order of the cemetery was, in some sense, the final administrative act of the war. The imposition of uniform organization on deaths that had been chaotic, individual, and in many cases grotesque, reducing them to a standard format of name, rank, date, and the symbol of the soldier's religion. The children of the war, the children who had been conceived and born during the conflict, and who were raised in households defined by absence and by the particular silences that men who had survived the front brought home with them, grew up in an environment shaped by the war without being told the truth about the war. The official commemoration structures, the memorials, the ceremonies, the language of sacrifice and honor, provided a framework for public acknowledgement that served social cohesion at the cost of accuracy. The veterans who could not live within that framework, who could not reconcile the public language of the war with what they had experienced, found that the available vocabulary was inadequate and that the available social spaces for speaking the truth of their experience were narrow. Some wrote the war literature that emerged in the late 1920s and early 1930s. Works like Erich Maria Remarques, All Quiet on the Western Front, Siegfried Sassoon's memoirs, Edmund Blunden's Undertones of War, provided a counter-narrative to the official account that had governed public understanding for a decade, and the public reception of these works. The recognition that they described something true that the official account had concealed was one of the stranger cultural moments of the interwar period. A moment when the gap between official history and lived experience briefly became visible and acknowledged, before the process of managing that gap resumed. The management of memory is one of the things that institutions do most efficiently, and the institutions of the major powers of World War I were, on the whole, effective at it. The scale of the losses was eventually acknowledged. The futility of some of the major operations was eventually acknowledged in qualified ways by some of the official histories. The psychological casualties of the war were eventually recognized as legitimate medical conditions deserving of systematic treatment, a recognition that came too late for most of the men who had been affected. The executed soldiers of the British Army were posthumously pardoned in 2006, 90 years after many of them were shot, a gesture that was described as providing closure for the families, and that was, by that point, addressed to grandchildren and great-grandchildren who had never known the men, because the men had been dead for 90 years. The machinery of the war did not stop immediately when the armistice was signed. The naval blockade of Germany that had been maintained by Britain throughout the war, a blockade that restricted food imports and contributed to a condition of malnutrition in the German civilian population that historians have estimated contributed to hundreds of thousands of civilian deaths, continued after the armistice while the peace negotiations proceeded at Paris. The blockade was maintained as a tool of pressure in the peace negotiations and was not lifted until July 1919, 8 months after the fighting ended. The German civilian population that had already experienced years of food shortage experienced 8 additional months of blockade, while the politicians who would eventually sign the Treaty of Versailles completed their deliberations. This fact was documented. It was known at the time. It appeared in the debates in the British Parliament. It produced public commentary from some observers who found it difficult to reconcile with the stated war aims of defending civilization and protecting the rights of small nations. It was then effectively removed from the central narrative of the war's conclusion and the peace settlement, where it remained peripheral in most accounts for most of the 20th century. The peace settlement itself, the Treaty of Versailles and the associated treaties that redrew the map of Europe, was constructed on the principle that the war had had a clear cause, a clearly guilty party, and that the resolution of the war required the formal acknowledgement of that guilt and the extraction of reparations proportional to the damage caused. Article 231 of the Treaty of Versailles, the War Guilt Clause, assigned to Germany and its allies sole responsibility for the war and all its damages, and this assignment was used to justify the reparations demands that Germany was required to accept as a condition of peace. The economic and political consequences of this settlement occupied the next 20 years of European history in ways that the men who had fought in the trenches and survived to read about the Paris negotiations found grimly unsurprising. The men who had fought in the war were, by the time the peace was signed, already being replaced as the primary subjects of the war's ongoing institutional management. They were becoming veterans rather than soldiers, which meant they were becoming a welfare category rather than a military asset, which meant the institutions that had organized their service were transitioning from organizations responsible for managing their performance to organizations responsible for managing their decline. Pension boards, disability assessments, hospital placements, charitable institutions for the care of the incapacitated, these became the institutional structures that mediated the relationship between the state and the men it had used. The rate at which men died in the years after the war from wounds, from the long-term consequences of gas exposure, from the diseases they had contracted in the field, from the conditions they had developed as a consequence of their service, was never officially counted as war mortality. These deaths occurred in hospital wards, in veterans' facilities, in private homes, separated in time from the military operations that had caused them, and they were therefore entered into different administrative categories than the deaths that had occurred during the fighting. This separation was not accidental. It served the function of containing the official death toll of the war within numbers that could be stated and processed, and eventually commemorated, rather than allowing the count to remain open in a way that would reflect the ongoing cost of the decisions that had been made in 1914 and after. The war left approximately 8 million men as prisoners of war across all the major powers. Their experiences varied enormously depending on which power held them, and what the conditions of that power's internal situation were at the time of their captivity. German prisoners held in Britain were, on the whole, treated in accordance with the existing international conventions. Russian prisoners held in Germany suffered from conditions that deteriorated as the German food situation deteriorated, and mortality rates in some German prisoner of war camps reached levels that reflected the same food shortages affecting the German civilian population. The hundreds of thousands of prisoners who died in captivity were counted among the war's dead. But the circumstances of their deaths reflected the institutional priorities of the holding powers rather than the circumstances of combat, and the categories of accountability that applied to them were different from those that applied to men killed in battle. The disease environment of the war extended well beyond the Western Front. The Gallipoli campaign of 1915, the attempt by the Allies to knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war by forcing the Dardanelles and capturing Constantinople, was a military failure whose casualty totals were substantially increased by the disease conditions of the peninsula. Dysentery, typhoid, and other enteric diseases spread through the cramped conditions of the Gallipoli beachhead, and the inadequate sanitation arrangements of a force that had been committed to a difficult terrain without adequate logistical preparation. The campaign was eventually abandoned, the forces evacuated in a withdrawal that was, in a bitter irony, the most competently executed operation of the entire Gallipoli enterprise. The dead remained. The lessons about disease prevention were carried forward by some medical officers and ignored by others, and the same fundamental failures of sanitation and disease control appeared in subsequent campaigns in other theaters. The Eastern Front, where the war was fought across enormous distances in conditions very different from the static trenches of the West, produced its own particular catalogue of suffering that has remained less thoroughly documented in the English-language histories of the war, because the primary sources are in Russian, German, and the languages of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and because the subsequent political upheavals in Russia, the Revolution, the Civil War, the Soviet period, disrupted the archival processes that might have preserved a more comprehensive record. What is known is that the casualty scale on the Eastern Front was comparable to the Western Front in absolute numbers, that the conditions under which men fought and the conditions under which civilians in the war zone lived were in many respects worse than those of the Western Front, and that the eventual collapse of the Russian state under the combined pressure of the war and the revolutionary movements it helped to generate produced a second category of violence, the Russian Civil War, that killed millions more in the years immediately following the armistice. The Ottoman Empire's conduct of the war against its Armenian population, the systematic deportation and mass killing that began in 1915, and that constitutes what the majority of contemporary scholars classify as genocide, occurred within the framework of the war and under the cover of wartime information management in a way that allowed its perpetrators to argue, at the time and afterward, that it was a wartime security measure rather than a program of extermination. The killing of approximately 1 million Armenians and the displacement and death of hundreds of thousands of Assyrian and Greek Christians in the same period was documented by foreign observers, including German military officers attached to the Ottoman army, American diplomatic representatives whose cables to Washington described what they were witnessing, and survivor accounts that were collected and published during and after the war. The information existed. The question of what the major powers should have done with it, whether anything could have been done, whether the conduct of the war created incentives for Allied powers to avoid pressing their Ottoman allies' enemies on the matter, was discussed at the time and has been discussed since. The mass killing continued. The war established, in ways that were recognized by some observers during the war and by more observers afterward, a new relationship between states and the populations they governed, a relationship in which the state's claim on the lives of its citizens was absolute, and the citizens' claim on the state was procedural. A man could be conscripted, he could be sent to conditions that would destroy his health. He could be shot by his own army for displaying the psychological symptoms of the conditions he had been sent to. His family could be told nothing accurate about what had happened to him. His pension could be denied on bureaucratic grounds. His body could be retained in the country where he had died, in a cemetery managed by an imperial commission, under a headstone that bore his name and rank, and the date of his death and a small carved symbol of his religion, and nothing else about who he had been. The number of men who returned from the war with some form of lasting physical disability, whether from wounds, from gas exposure, from the effects of disease, from the consequences of surgical procedures performed in field conditions, was never precisely counted across all the major powers, because counting it would have required a consistent definition of disability and a consistent administrative system for recording it that did not exist. Estimates suggest that several million men on all sides were left with permanent physical impairments. They lived in societies that had constructed their expectations of male physical capacity around the standards of the pre-war world, and they negotiated their way through those societies with bodies that had been changed by the industrial processes of a war that those societies had organized and supported, and were now, in the post-war period, attempting to commemorate and explain in terms that made the commemoration bearable. The commemoration took forms that reflected the institutional needs of the states conducting it, as much as the needs of the populations who had suffered. The great memorials, the Menin Gate at Ypres with its 54,000 names of the missing, the Thiepval Memorial to the missing of the Somme with its 72,000 names, the French ossuary at Douaumont near Verdun containing the bones of approximately 130,000 unidentified French and German soldiers, the Arlington Cemetery, the war cemeteries on the Gallipoli Peninsula. These were not primarily expressions of grief in the private sense. They were institutions. They were physical structures built by state resources and maintained by state institutions, and their function was to organize, contain, and give form to a scale of death that would otherwise remain shapeless. The poppy, which became the primary symbol of remembrance in Britain and the Commonwealth, had been growing on the battlefields of the Western Front, because poppies are pioneer plants that colonize disturbed earth, and the Western Front was the most thoroughly disturbed earth in Europe. The association between the poppy and the war dead was established in a poem by a Canadian medical officer, John McCrae, who wrote it after a burial service for a friend in May 1915, and who died of pneumonia while on active service in January 1918. The poem, In Flanders Fields, described the poppies growing over the graves of the dead, and the dead speaking through the flowers to the living, asking them to keep faith with the cause. The poem was used extensively in wartime propaganda, reproduced in newspapers and pamphlets, and used in recruitment campaigns. Because its emotional register, the dead speaking from their graves to ask the living to continue the fight, served the institutional purpose of maintaining public support for a war that was producing casualties on a scale that threatened that support. The poem became the basis of the remembrance poppy after a suggestion by an American professor, Moyna Michael, who began wearing a red poppy in November 1918 as a personal act of remembrance, and who subsequently organized the sale of poppies to raise money for veterans. The practice spread through the former Allied countries and became institutionalized as the primary public gesture of remembrance for the war dead in Britain and the Commonwealth. The poppy is now one of the most widely recognized symbols of the war. What is less often noted is the trajectory of its origin. A poem written in a field near the graves of newly dead men, deployed as a propaganda instrument by the state that was sending more men to die, transformed after the war into a charitable fundraising mechanism for the surviving casualties of the state's decisions, institutionalized as the central symbol of a public remembrance practice that transformed grief into ceremony and ceremony into civic obligation. The armies that had fought the war were demobilized, but the institutions that had managed them were not entirely dissolved. The military planning establishments that had organized the mobilization of millions of men retained institutional knowledge, organizational structures, and, in many cases, personnel who would still be in position 20 years later when the next war began. The lessons of the war were analyzed in staff colleges and strategic planning documents. Some of those lessons were genuinely absorbed and led to changes in doctrine and tactics. Some were not absorbed, or were absorbed in ways that reproduced the fundamental problems in new forms. The next war would use many of the same instruments the first had used, organized by institutions that had inherited their structure from the institutions of the first war, and it would produce casualties on a scale that exceeded even the industrialized killing of 1914 to 1918. The men who had served in the First War and who lived long enough to see the Second were asked, in some cases, to account for the relationship between the two. Some of them had spent the interwar years in public advocacy for disarmament, for international cooperation, for political structures that might prevent the recurrence of what they had experienced. Some of them had simply attempted to resume their lives, to work and raise families and exist in the ordinary way that the existence of a person requires. Some of them had not been able to do either, because the conditions they had carried home from the front did not permit the ordinary functions of civilian life. All of them had lived, in one way or another, in the shadow of an institutional process that had organized their expenditure as one component of a military calculation and then organized their commemoration as one component of a political calculation, and that had, at no point in either process, required their consent or their understanding. The final accounting of what World War I established as normal cannot be reduced to a list of specific horrors, because the specific horrors were not the point. They were the content of the normalization, not the normalization itself. What the war normalized was the principle that the organized machinery of modern states could mobilize the lives of their citizens at a scale, and with an efficiency that made individual experience irrelevant to institutional outcome, that the documentation of that mobilization and its costs could be managed in ways that served political purposes, that the suffering produced by institutional decisions could be transformed through appropriate commemorative practices into evidence of the worthiness of the decisions, and that all of this could be repeated. The institutions that processed the paperwork of the dead in 1916 and 1917 and 1918 continued to operate. The forms were different. The scale was different. The technology was different. The process was the same. The categories were the same. The relationship between the individual life and the institutional requirement was the same. And when the next war came, 21 years after the armistice, the machinery that had been built for the first one was available, tested, and ready.